And I want to start, I'll start us off with a few questions. I want to ask the panel a couple of things to get started, and then we're going to open it up to the room. And I want to start with you, David, but this is, I'd like you, all three of you, to talk about this a little bit. So I'm curious about the degree to which the novelty of the context is something you would want to, a subject in the context of having an interaction, like whether it's with a non-player character in a game, whether it's with a virtual human, as Stacy was talking about, or with a robot. There is some very significant utility to probing the dynamics of a novel context that may actually supersede the reward and incentive dynamics that you're actually testing in the experimental construct. That is to say, it might be more valuable to know whether or not robots are trustworthy, whether or not robots are out to screw you, whether or not they are dupes, and probing the apparatus. And so one of the ways you might get past that is about testing repeatedly with the same subjects with the same robot, for instance, over time. And we heard a little bit about that at the end. So my question to you is can you discern what's going on there? Can you control for that?
Yeah, let me just say briefly. I mean, when we had people interact with the robot, one thing that we had to do first was give them more time, because for the first, so we doubled the time, because the first few minutes people are like, oh my God, I'm talking to a robot. But once they got beyond that fact, they kind of got into it in a comfortable way. So I think you're right. There's the main effect of what do I think about this entity, and a lot of the questions were, what's the robot going to do with the money? But I think people, at least in these were people of all ages, they quickly adapted to it. I think once it reaches a certain level of humanness, the mind's willing to accept and adapt to it.
Magy, I was struck in your, just reflecting on my own experience with gamers, that many gamers will go into a game and engage in what looks like extremely psychotic behavior. They just go around killing all the non-player characters just to see what happens. It's sort of a related
We were actually looking at exactly that. Yeah. We had actually developed a game to look at personality, and we were just reviewing actually different gamer behaviors. One particular one, basically, all they did, they tried to do the game in the beginning, and I guess they got frustrated, so they took out, not the gun, because the gun will, of course, not do as much damage, so they took out a baseball bat and they started hammering every character that we had in the game. This is kind of an interesting question, because they basically didn't want to conform with the game. They wanted to see what happens when they do different things that wasn't expected. So that itself was kind of an interesting personality aspect that I think we need to take into account, because they are not looking at the characters in that particular game as people. They were looking at them as artificial beings that are supposed to give them quests. So they were behaving differently.
Stacy, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think one of the things that fascinates when we're talking about these technologies and increasingly people are finding that people interact with them as if they're humans. I think there's also interesting differences. And I think when we study these phenomena, we have to also look at the fact that, for instance, people are finding phenomenon out that people will tend to disclose more personal information to a virtual character than they will to a real human being, because they don't see the same consequences. So in fact, we're in this interesting situation where we have to sort of explore the interaction with this virtual entity as almost like a unique psychological phenomenon. We want to use it as a psychological stimuli, but there are some interesting differences in terms of how people interact with it that we really need to sort of investigate.
Yeah, I was struck actually, one of my interest is in microexpressions and these sort of very, very tiny cues that are permeate all of our interactions. You listed quite a lot of dimensions of those nonverbal carriers of information. David, you had a relatively narrow set of behaviors that we're supposed to convey, and I mentioned at the beginning sort of an uncanny valley. I wonder if there is do you see some sort of weird drop-off as things get human-like but not quite human, zombie-like, essentially,
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why you really need to worry about, if you make it a sort of a photoreal character, that it looks very much like a human being, you really have to worry about giving it appropriate behaviors, right dynamics and enough behaviors. Because as soon as it stops moving, it dies. It looks like it's dead. So you really have to worry about creating this sort of, this constant motion that you see in people in these characters.
Yeah.
And sort of, people have cheated by putting in things like idle behaviors. Those cheats also break down. So we really have to be thinking more carefully about what moment to moment is happening in terms of the behaviors of these characters.
One more question for the trio, and then let's open it up to the room. And I want to just quickly ask you about cross-cultural affect in the context of what you're studying here. I come from Italians, and I married a Swede. And my father-in-law, the first time I met my father-in-law, we had an affective gap that was fairly substantial. And so I was thinking, he looks like one of those virtual people, actually. I'm curious about the degree to which culture constrains the insights here. I know there's been some work, for instance, David, on ultimatum games, for instance. There's a researcher at, I'm just totally blank, up in Nova Scotia, who's
Heinrich, UBC?
Yeah, Heinrich, at UBC, who's been doing work, doing cross-cultural analysis and finding wide variability. So I wondered if do you see any of those artifacts yet? How culturally constrained are what you're learning for all three of you?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done any cross-cultural work, and I don't mean to give you the assumption that these four cues are the only cues that matter. Lots of cues are going to matter, and they're contained by context, and the brain is processing more. These were sufficient for us, but I'm sure there's going to be cross-cultural variability in how they're interpreted, but we haven't done that work yet.
That's great. Okay, let's go out here. I think there was a question.
Yeah, so one of the things you discussed or I was focused on has been making robots more human-like so that you can analyze the human behavior and how this control the robot. But I'm curious, as virtual technology expands, what if you do the opposite with the robot? You give the trust signals, but then have the robot do the opposite, cheat them out of it. And how will that then change the human reaction to robots, or can we change, or are we stuck in this intrinsic reaction?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, and I'm sure it's going to be reciprocal. So Jinju, stand up over there. So Jinju actually is developing algorithms based on the cues we found to actually allow the technology to read what a human's going to do and make predictions about it. We haven't then taken the step yet to have it adjust its behavior, but I firmly believe it's an iterative process. That's what I meant. It's kind of like trust is a dance. I can't tell you what I'm going to do till I can kind of bootstrap a sense of what you're going to do. And I think it's a rather iterative cycle.
But I'm interested, like, I don't know if anybody's been hacked here or something like that, but at some point you get cheated, if you will. You think you trust someone, and then you find out that it's false. And so if that interaction happens with robots, at what point in our evolution with technology do we stop believing these signals? Do we stop trusting the intrinsic behavior that psychologically is already in place? Can it change?
That's a good question. I'm sure it will change just like it does to humans. The big question is, will it bleed from a robot into a human? I don't know.
That's a good question, period. So it can change. Let's go over here.
I'm Helen Rees. I'm from Harvard Medical School, and I'm really interested in this use of virtual humans to teach medical trainees. And I just like your response to, is there any concern that when you said technology may actually be changing how humans relate to one another, that if trainees are learning responses or how to respond to virtual humans, that they may actually take on less human attributes and learn from those virtual humans as opposed to learning from real patients or virtual patients that are healthy.
So, yes.
Let me see if I can paraphrase the question as I understood it, and actually it's probably better for you to do the same. And that is that in the context of learning from training doctors on virtual humans, are we training them to a specific set of behaviors that may lead them farther away or versus closer to the dynamics of genuine peer-to-peer, human-to-human interactions? Is that a close approximation? Okay.
Yeah, so I actually think there's there's a term called negative training, where basically you're being trained, the training system is actually teaching you the wrong things. And essentially that's at the heart of what you're asking. I think it's a real question, right? It's a really very important question. I mean, one of the things we do is we have a large board of people, experts in nonverbal behavior, experts in social interaction, basically evaluating what we're doing, often like on a daily basis as the product gets developed, so that we have some sense of, are we doing the right things? The issue though, the alternative though, is standardized patients. And there you have you have another kind of problem where each these standardized patients are actors that are trained to behave like they're suffering some condition. The problem with that approach is, one, obviously it's costly, but the more severe problems are that you don't have uniformity across the actors and what they're doing. So you also don't have control over the training experience. Plus the fact the actors cannot simulate certain medical conditions like you can on a virtual patient. So there are trade-offs. I agree that it sounds somewhat strange to be using a virtual human to teach social skills to a doctor, for example, for a medical student.
You clearly haven't hung out with a lot of doctors that I know, so.
But the key for us is really just having people, having doctors, medical school professionals, as well as experts in nonverbal behavior, constantly consulting with us to make sure that what we're doing is on target. But I agree, if you 100%, it's a real danger that we have to be careful about.
Let's go over here.
Hey, Gail Charpentier, I'm a clinician at Harvard Vanguard Medical. So there's no research history except in college. My question is ethics and the pure application here, and whether there is research or people in academia overlooking or checking in on the ethical aspect of this, especially when you mentioned marketing. And I realize that whenever there's new ideas, there's resistance, and that's part of where I'm coming from, perhaps, with the marketing and the other.
I'm not sure if the marketing question is aimed towards me, but the ethics question I can address. Yeah. So basically, again, we have medical people who are really focusing in on how we're actually building these interactions, evaluating them in terms of their impact on the students, in terms of making sure that they're consistent with the training paradigms that are at those various medical schools. So there's, on that project I showed that short clip of, there's 4 different medical schools and basically training faculty on those 4 medical schools involved with us on this project. I mean, basically that's, we just have to be really careful, and there's a lot of oversight there. But I agree, these are very important issues.
Can I ask?
I don't know about the reference to marketing.
Right. I'd like Maggie. You want to take a crack at that since you're.
So, there is ethics in multiple things, and also data that we're collecting, because there's a lot of data that we're collecting here. And there are a number of people that actually do work on ethics and collection of data, and especially with none of this data is basically associated with the people, so we don't know who that people are. So it's all very unique, and so it's not. And it's interesting because in the last few we had there was a paper published about game data and went out to the public, and there was a number of discussions in 2011. There were a lot of backfire because they were like, well, there's this privacy, this is my behavior, why are they looking at my behavior to look at making the game better? And then there is another paper that was published in 2013, and there was another discussion. The discussion was very different, and they're like, oh, they're making the game better. I'm actually helping making the game better. This is great. So I think with Facebook and a lot of other things, of course, coming out, and there are people actually sharing their information, there is a change also in how people are looking at privacy and data.
We're going to take 2. Let's go one from online.
Sure. This is from Twitter, and the question is, they're wondering what the role of gender, for example, a female robot voice versus a male robot voice, plays in emotion, technology, and trustworthiness.
I think it'll play the same role now. Now, Nexi was, as you probably saw, was developed to be rather neotenous. That is, she's kind of baby-faced. And I think, Jinju, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've used both voices for her, or is she typically female? But, you can, I'm sure as we approach more and more human entities, those people are going to, just like they're layering moral motivations, they're going to lay in their gender stereotypes to it. But let me ask Magy and Stacy, because you guys probably have more gender-defined creatures.
Well, I mean, as soon as you cross over the gender line, you get different results. It's a very powerful impact in terms of how people interpret the virtual character. So often you find in some of our studies where the person is just focusing on one gender versus the other because they know that they're not going to be able to handle that variability in experimental design. But basically, it has a powerful impact. So the nonverbal behavior is judged completely different across the gender lines.
We have time for one more to keep our schedule on track, so we're going to come back here.
I'm Ryan from Adobe Research, and thank you for fantastic presentations. The question I have is slightly different, I think, from using robots sort of to mimic human behavior. I'm more interested in how people's behavior are changing in response to user interface designs that are non-human. So one example would be, let's say iPad, you open or you move things in this way. Now there are certain infants or babies that I've observed, this is anecdotal, in Silicon Valley that think they can open other things that way. Or
Can I interject with a story? Just 2 seconds. So we have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and my 4-year-old at age like 10 months could pick it up, turn it on, navigate to a game, and beat me at it. And then when she learned to move around, every square rectangular object it didn't matter whether it was an iPad or not, had swipe marks on it for about 6 months as she determined which rectangular glass objects had magical creatures inside them and which ones didn't. And the first time that she climbed on the couch and was about to tip over and crash, and and I went, Amelia, no. She looked at me for a moment and she went, she's like, I want to swipe to the new daddy. This is a current, present tense set of problems for parents of small children at this very moment. So please continue.
Well, that's way better than my explanation. I don't have a child, so I will only observe this remotely. But I see this in multiple domains too. This could be in our social interactions and how certain things you can do online, perhaps you couldn't do offline, and maybe the way we search things or we navigate the world. And it seems like the way in which that's influencing human life and emotion is slightly different than perhaps ways in which we're using technology to mimic existing human behavior. I'm wondering, do you think, sort of the tangible question is, do you think these ways of behavior will remain as kind of communication patterns of trust or other things, or as we move forward and technology becomes more pervasive, the whole language of communication, will that change?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. In some ways, I think maybe we should wait for Arturo to answer that, right? Because there's all kinds of of data out there on our Facebook users more trusting and what types of communications they come in. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the technology is approaching more human, and so the question is, as it approaches more human, at least the technology we're talking about, maybe not, but there are certainly other technologies that probably will modify how we interact, I would guess.
And with that, will you please join me in thanking this terrific panel of presenters to kick us off this morning. Thank you very, very much, all of you.